understanding mountain bike geometry can be pretty daunting. And some of you might not even know what it means. But it's the way I can tell how a mountain bike is going to ride just by looking at a chart of numbers. My name is Bailey. I'm a design engineer, expert level mountain biker, and co-founder of Kinetic. I look at bikes, training, and performance through both lenses. So let's get into it. In the last decade, I've ridden over 40 different mountain bikes across 18 different brands. Bikes I've owned, bought, sold, traded, demoed, and borrowed. And once you ride enough bikes, you start to notice patterns. Most of how a bike feels comes back to just a few key geometry numbers. And every brand publishes the full geometry chart. Many riders that look at it have no idea what they're actually looking at. So here are the 3 numbers that I look at first, plus 1 bonus, to understand how a bike will fit and how it's going to ride. Whoa, reverse mullet. So here's our lovely mountain bike. And the first measurement that I always look at is reach. The reach of a mountain bike is quite literally how far you have to reach to get from the pedals to the handlebars. This measures in millimeters, and it measures from the center of the bottom bracket and a horizontal line over to the center of the head tube. So if you took the middle of the bottom bracket and the middle of the head tube and drew them up to some arbitrary point where they were the same level, and then measured them horizontally, that is your reach number. So top tube measurements are very common in road bikes or BMX bikes. This is kind of irrelevant because the slope, the angle of a top tube on a mountain bike varies completely all over the place. So this is a consistent measure you can use to figure out how far, again, how long that front end of the bike is. Similarly, the chainstay length is a good measure for the back half of the mountain bike. It's measured from the center of the rear axle to the center of the bottom bracket. That is down here. So that is your chain stay, often just CS abbreviated. So that's your chainstay length. Now the third measurement is the head tube angle. This is your head tube angle, which is always abbreviated HT, usually. Those 3 measurements can tell you a whole heck of a lot individually, but also combined to paint a bigger picture of how the bike itself is going to perform. Starting with reach. A bike with a longer reach is going to be more stable and easier to ride fast. The caveat, or where that finds its limit, is in corners and maneuverability. A shorter reached bike is going to be way easier to maneuver, to pop, get off the ground, to corner, to throw whips and play around on in the air on jumps. But as you start getting faster and steeper and more technical, it's going to become unstable. So there's kind of a sweet spot in there somewhere that you want to shoot for. And as you ride more bikes and as you figure out your sizing, depending on how tall you are, you start to figure out what reach you like. So for me, I'm going to write my numbers in blue. So I've got real short legs, I've got a tall torso, I'm about 5'10". I prefer reach numbers that range between 450 and 480. Now, thanks to cockpit components and bike setup and stem length and bar roll and all kinds of other things you can get into in the cockpit side, you can fudge reach here or there 5 or 10 millimeters. So in general, it's okay to have a ballpark that you like to shoot for. And if the bike you want doesn't come in the exact reach number you want, get as close as you can. But this is the best way to figure out what size bike you need. Most bikes these days are sized based on reach. Now, why is my range so wide? Well, it's because I ride a lot of different bikes. I like my trail bikes to be very poppy and playful. I like them to be light and easy to maneuver and easy to pop and jump around the trail. But a lot of what I ride on my trail bike is out in the forest, whether it be Pisgah or out west or anywhere we're traveling. I want to be able to just have fun and pop and play on my trail bike. I'm not too worried about going fast or racing enduro. So I stick to a roughly like 450 is even a little short, but 450 is about as short of a reach as I'll go. Before any shorter than 450, I start to feel real cramped and it gets really unstable at speed. This still gives me enough space to move. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, my downhill bikes are closer to this 480 number. I think my downhill race bike last year was 460 476, I believe, reach. And that is again because my downhill bike is my race bike. The whole point is to go fast. And so I give up a little bit of maneuverability for a lot more stability. I need to be comfortable going 20, 25, 30 miles an hour on rough terrain on that bike. Whereas on this bike, I'm probably not going that fast. And I'd rather just have fun and work on my bike skills when I'm on my trail rides. So that's reach. Moving on to chainstay length. These two are related a little bit, which I'll get to in a second, but chainstay length is gonna similarly affect how either stable and confidence inspiring and fast a bike feels, or how poppy and playful and maneuverable it is. Like you could imagine, shorter chainstays, a shorter rear end, is less of a bike to get around corners. It's less of a lever to pop and pull against when you're trying to do manuals or bunny hops. So shorter chainstays help you, I would say, for lack of a better term, have more fun on your bike. And longer chainstays are going to help you go faster and be more stable on faster, rougher terrain. I think chainstay length ranges anywhere from 430 millimeters all the way out to 460 millimeters on some downhill bikes. Again, longer is going to be more stable and better for speed and rough terrain. Shorter is going to be more poppy, playful, and better for snappy cornering and maneuverability. So similarly, I think my downhill bikes are somewhere in the 450 to 455 chainstay length. My trail bikes are between 435 and 440, if I'm not mistaken, just for reference. Now, third is head tube angle. This is the angle from the horizontal plane down to the fork or down to the head tube of how steep or slack your bike is. So when you hear people talk about, oh, that bike's so slack, that bike's so steep, they're usually talking about head tube angle. Now you'll hear steep and slack seat tube angles also, which refers to pedaling and climbing capabilities. But most mountain biking applications are going to be referring to head tube angle because that is the riding characteristics across all terrain, especially up front on the bike. So a slacker or lower number, if you will, head tube angle, as it could be as low as 63 degrees, which is the standard for most downhill bikes. That's going to be better for like downhill speed, stability at speed, more technical steep terrain, because the front wheel is farther out in front of you, and so it's going to absorb the impacts much better and not send you as much over the bars. For example, on the other end of the spectrum, I think like 67 plus degrees is what you see on most cross-country bikes, seen as high as like the low 70s. And that's because while slack bikes are great at descending, they suck at steering. If you're going to corner a big downhill bike, you really have to lean it over to get around corners. You can't steer it very well. And that's because the front wheel is just so far out. Whereas a steeper bike, something like a 67, 68, 69 degree head tube angle, is going to feel like you're constantly getting pitched over the bars. But that's good for climbing. That's really good for technical climbing and cross-country riding, because you need to keep enough weight on the front wheel and have traction on the front tire to be able to get up those technical climbs. Now, the sweet spot for most trail bikes is right here in the middle, around 65 degrees. You have some enduro bikes that go a little more aggressive. If you hear aggressive, think slack, think lower number. And then you have some downcountry bikes, some lighter weight travel, some lighter travel trail bikes that trend towards the steeper side. Think steeper, think bigger number, think more cross country. So slacker head tube angle, think more downhill. Steeper head tube angle, think bigger number, cross country pedaling. Now what gets really interesting is when you compare how these all relate together. And to demonstrate this, to illustrate this, I'm going to compare my latest favorite trail bike I've ever ridden, the Ari Delano Peak. It is just absolutely perfectly balanced and fun. I'm going to compare that with one of the most unbalanced, aggressive trail bikes that I've ever ridden, the Specialized status. So we'll say the Ari Delano Peak is going to be in green. and we'll do the Specialized Status in red. Now, starting with the Ari Delano Peak. The reach numbers, so again, reach is a sliding scale. I usually fall between a size medium frame or a size large frame. I'm usually right in between for most brands. Some brands like Trek have a medium large, but other brands like Ari have their medium is a 455 reach, which is perfect for that playful poppy style that I like my trail bikes to have. And then if I wanted to size up, if I was going to race enduro on this, if I wanted to be a little more aggressive, if I didn't have a downhill bike, etc., and I wanted something that was going to be faster for bigger days, their large is a 480. So either way, at my height, I size down, but if I was racing enduro on this bike, I would size up just to have more stability. Either way, very reasonable, right in the kind of perfect balanced ranges there. The chainstays on the Ari are 434, so just a little bit longer than my low end that I prefer. Again, really good sweet spot, and that's as a full 29er, you can run with a flip chip. That's getting more detailed and nuanced, but you can run the Delano as a mullet as well if you make a slight adjustment to the frame. So either way, 434 on the short end, but not so short that it gets real fiddly. Still a good bit of stability, still a good bit of balance. And then the head tube angle on the Delano is right dead on that sweet spot of 65 degrees for the head tube angle. So overall, very balanced. The relationship here between the reach, especially in the medium, the reach and the chainstay balance front to back keeps your weight front of center, but not extremely. So if you think about your center of gravity, I always like riding bikes that keep my center of gravity or my body position forward, because mountain biking is not only the most fun and the best, but it's also the safest when you're riding aggressively, when you are up over the front and attacking the trail. So I like bikes that will have a much more forward position on them. Ari achieves that with this bike without making it crazy. Speaking of crazy, we're going to get into the Specialized Status. Now, if you guys don't know about the Specialized Status, it is one of the most brilliant moments of opportunistic thinking from a design standpoint on behalf of their engineers. This bike came about because Specialized had a bunch of, and you comment warriors, feel free to fact check me on this. The story I've heard is that the Status 160 came about because the old Enduro, not the current model, the old model of the Specialized Enduro had in China, in their factories, they had a bunch of extra rear ends for that bike that they didn't know what to do with. They were going to have to scrap them. They just had a ton of extra supply of these rear ends that were non-UDH. They didn't fit a universal derailleur hanger. They didn't fit the new bike with the new linkage design. This was like right around 2020. 2020, 2021 maybe. And so they were also, after 2019, they were phasing out the old Stump Jumper Evo. And so they had some front triangles from the old Stump Jumper Evo. And because they were going towards the new Stump Jumper design that released in, I believe, 2020 or 2021 as well. So some genius engineer figured out how to take all of these parts that they were going to have to scrap, create a new linkage that was going to fit the old Enduro rear end to the old Stump Jumper front end. And they came up with a new bike that they could manufacture cheaply and promote as a perfect entry-level mountain bike. Problem, though, and where it gets a little weird, is that the front ends of the bike were all a little bit more modern. All of these rear ends were all 27.5, so it had to be mullet, and the rear ends were really, really short. How short? Well, the chainstay was only all the way down here. The chainstays were 426. And this was the shortest rear end on a bike I'd ever ridden. Trail bike, down, didn't matter. This was I'd had hardtails with longer chainstays than this, which is why. But that made the bike super flicky, super playful, and super fun, especially on jumps and tight corners and steeps. Now they paired this with a very, very long reach. I actually started on an S4, which would have been the large, and it had a 487 reach. So when I had my first Specialized Status, it was simultaneously the longest reach bike I'd ever owned and the shortest chainstay bike I'd ever owned. So it was really hard for me to adequately weight both wheels, especially because the head angle was right down next to the 63 number like downhill bikes. So this bike was fascinating to me from a geometry standpoint because it was so far out of the norm. And it was really good at a couple things, and it was really bad at a couple others. So if you wanted to get into downhill, or if you wanted to get into aggressive enduro gravity style mountain biking, and you had a small budget, I think these bikes came out at $3,000 and they only got cheaper. You can find them on Facebook Marketplace now for $1,000 if you look hard enough. This is a great bike to get started on, but it's got some drawbacks. Remember how I said I like having bikes that keep me over the front or that encourage you to ride aggressively? This bike is the extreme case. Mondraker is one of the biggest brands that was famous for this back as early as 2011, 2012, 2013. They had short stems, wide bars, long reaches, and short chainstays, way before it was cool. And then I actually had my specialized status after my Mondraker Foxy trail bike and after my Mondraker Summum downhill bike. And this bike was more extreme than either of my Mondrakers. And if you bike nerds that know history know that's kind of wild. So what does this mean in terms of riding position and why do I care? Well, if you think about the balance between the front center or the reach, the front half of the bike, and the chainstay length, the rear half of the bike, your weight is always going to be between the two wheels. So if the bottom bracket is here, right? But the middle of the bike, the center between the two wheels is here, that means your chest is going to have to be over the stem. Your hips are going to have to be in front of the bottom bracket almost, just to keep the wheels evenly weighted. In order to keep even weight distribution on the front and rear wheel together so you have consistent traction for predictable cornering, predictable trackability, and for it to be a good balanced ride that you can confidently push, you have to ride with your weight so far forward. Often, on this bike, it's really easy, especially with the slack head tube angle, with the front wheel so far out, it's really easy to get your weight too far back, which then takes weight off of the front wheel, which then allows this to just slip out and wash the front out. Very, very common problem on the status. Or you learn how to ride super aggressive, super over the front of this bike, and then you hit it, you get riding over your head, you are riding above your skill level, and you get chucked over the front and end up crashing because your body weight's not where you're used to it being or where you're prepared for it to be. So just one example of how bike geometry can drastically change the way a bike rides. And as you can expect, the status climbed like a potato. It does not want to get up hills. Granted, it's got a lockout switch on the shock. It's got 12 speed on the drivetrain. It's got a small chainring up front. So you can put your saris in a sack and you can get up any climb. You're just going to be a little slower than your buddies. Or you're just going to get a little stronger than your buddies because you're working twice as hard. Either way you look at it, I prefer to take the positive approach. But super interesting study into two bikes that seem to have a very similar role. Specialized even made a 140, 160 travel status. And you could make your Delano 140, 160 with a mullet and get not that crazy different geometry. So I find that this is an interesting comparison and an interesting case study, and these three key numbers can make such a big difference in the way a bike rides. You can look at an entire geometry sheet and pick out these three numbers and start to get a general idea of what that bike's going to do. Unfortunately, today we don't all have the opportunity to demo all of the bikes in the world, but the internet is an awesome place where you can go look up geometry charts and start to figure out what bike you might be interested in. Ari especially makes this super easy on their website. They make it super easy to find all the geometry charts for all of their bike models, and they even fit all of the bikes directly to you when you order from Ari on their website, on aribikes.com. So with that, I told you I would give you one more bonus, and that is bottom bracket height or bottom bracket drop is going to do one specific thing. The height of the bottom bracket is going to dictate a lot about how the bike rides as well. Not in so much of a what type of riding does this bike want to do, but more in terms of what kind of characteristic or what kind of personality is this bike going to have. What do I mean by that? Now, brands will either call this bottom bracket height or bottom bracket drop. They're two different things. One measures the bottom bracket height off of the ground. One of them and the other measures the bottom bracket drop is if you drew a line between the two axles and dropped the bottom bracket below that. Either way, it's all relative. You can compare between bikes. What you'll often see is that climbing or pedaling bikes have higher bottom brackets because you want pedal clearance to get through technical climbs because you're constantly pedaling. Whereas downhill bikes, enduro bikes, things that are a little more aggressive and downhill oriented that aren't going to pedal as much through the rocky terrain are going to have lower bottom brackets. Why on earth would you want a lower bottom bracket? Well, that's because the lower your center of mass is on the bike, the more planted and stable it's going to feel. So if you've ever heard people talk about it feels like I'm riding in the bike instead of on top of the bike, or this bike feels like I'm riding on top of the bike instead of in it, that usually refers to a little bit of stock height, but most of the time that can be tracked back to the bottom bracket height. So I prefer, again, the feeling of being in the bike and more planted and stable inside the bike, like I'm a part of this machine working together. Other people prefer a more upright position and to stand on top of their bike. For example, the Scott Ransom is a bike that I've ridden that felt very much on top of that bike. Felt very tall, very stand-up-ish, very upright. Versus something like the Status or something like my downhill bikes feel very planted because they have much lower bottom brackets. Personally, I prefer to have the lowest bottom bracket possible without risking pedal strikes. The Status was a little low. The Delano is a little bit higher than that, and that's kind of in the sweet spot as well. So with that, that is a quick overview of mountain bike geometry. Hopefully that all made sense. If you have questions about this, I'll be hanging out in the comments for a little bit here and can answer any questions you have about mountain bike geometry. If you found this interesting, make sure to subscribe and drop a like to let me know that you like videos like this, and I will make more of them. I plan on doing a lot more mountain bike tech reviews and nerding out on bike tech stuff going forward, because I am a massive nerd and I need an outlet for it. So you're welcome. So if this was interesting and you want to see a part 2, let me know. If there's anything I missed or if there's anything I got wrong, feel free to fact check me. These are the things that I have learned through my own nerding and puzzling and tinkering with bikes over the last better part of a decade. And I just want to help make this information more accessible so more people can enjoy the most amazing sport and community that the world could have possibly offered to us in this day and age. So with that, I got to get the heck out of here because I'm going for a bike ride. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, like this video if you liked it, share it with a friend if you found it insightful, and if you learned something, let us know. I will see you again very soon. Cheers, friends.